Imagine being thrown into a pit by your own brothers, sold as a slave, and falsely imprisoned, only to emerge as the second most powerful man in the ancient world. This is Joseph's impossible story, where God's hidden hand transforms every betrayal into blessing. In Egypt's royal court, a Hebrew slave will interpret dreams that kings cannot understand, revealing 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of devastating famine. But this isn't merely a tale of personal triumph. It's the divine strategy that preserves God's chosen people and sets the stage for the greatest rescue mission in history. The Exodus. Joseph's life mirrors the future Messiah. Rejected by his brothers, exalted by Gentiles, becoming the savior of his family. Through tears of forgiveness and divine revelation, we'll witness how God weaves together human choices and heavenly purposes. This story proves that nothing, not jealousy, betrayal, or injustice, can thwart God's eternal plan. In the rolling hills of Canaan, where sheep grazed on green pastures, and the wind carried stories across the desert, an old man named Jacob held a special place in his heart for one son above all others. Joseph was different from his 11 brothers, and everyone in the household could see it from the moment he walked into a room. Joseph was different from his 11 brothers, and everyone in the household could see it from the moment he walked into a room, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. This wasn't just any ordinary love between father and son that you might find in any family. Joseph had been born when Jacob was already an old man, a precious gift that came to him in the twilight of his life from his beloved wife Rachel, the woman he had loved since the first moment he saw her by the well. Rachel had been the love of Jacob's life, the woman he had worked 14 years to marry. And when she died giving birth to Benjamin, Jacob's heart was broken. But in Joseph, he saw Rachel's beautiful face and gentle spirit living on. Every time Jacob looked at Joseph's eyes, he remembered the way Rachel used to look at him with such love and trust. Every time Joseph smiled, Jacob could see Rachel's smile shining through. The boy carried his mother's beauty and his father's dreams, making him impossible to ignore among the bustling household of 12 sons who competed for their father's attention every single day. The other brothers worked hard in the fields, tended the sheep, and tried to prove themselves worthy of their father's love. But Jacob's eyes always seemed to follow Joseph wherever he went. When Joseph spoke, Jacob listened with a kind of attention that the other brothers rarely received. When Joseph made a mistake, Jacob corrected him gently. But when the other brothers made mistakes, they faced harsh words and punishment. This special love wasn't hidden or subtle. It was obvious to everyone who lived in Jacob's tents, creating an atmosphere of jealousy and resentment that grew stronger with each passing day. One day, Jacob decided to show the entire world just how special Joseph was to him. He called the finest craftsmen from the surrounding area and ordered them to create something extraordinary, a coat unlike any other worn in all the land of Canaan. This wasn't going to be the simple, rough garment that shepherds wore while tending sheep under the burning sun, or the practical robes that merchants wore while traveling dusty roads. Genesis 37:3 describes how Jacob made him a coat of many colors. And this phrase barely captures the magnificence of what Jacob created for his beloved son. The coat was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, woven with threads of brilliant blues like the morning sky, deep purples like royal robes, rich scarlets like precious rubies, and golden yellows like sunshine itself. The sleeves were long and flowing, reaching down to Joseph's wrists, and the hem swept almost to the ground, making Joseph look like a prince walking among common people. Every thread was carefully chosen, every pattern deliberately designed, every color perfectly placed to create something that would take your breath away when you saw it. When Joseph put on this magnificent coat for the first time, he was transformed. He no longer looked like just another shepherd boy from Canaan. He looked like nobility, like someone destined for greatness. like a young man who was clearly marked for a special purpose. The other brothers wore plain, practical clothes suitable for hard work in the fields. Simple brown and gray robes that could get dirty without causing concern, sturdy sandals that could handle rocky ground, and head coverings that protected them from the sun. But Joseph's coat announced to everyone who saw him that he was different, that he was chosen, that he was loved above all others. Neighbors would stop and stare when Joseph walked by in his beautiful coat. Merchants would whisper among themselves about Jacob's obvious favoritism. Even strangers could tell immediately that this young man was someone special in his father's eyes. The coat became a daily reminder of their father's unequal love. A beautiful burden that Joseph wore with pride, but that would ultimately change the course of his entire life. Joseph began having dreams that were unlike anything he had experienced before in his 17 years of life. These weren't ordinary dreams that fade with the morning light and leave you wondering what they meant. These were vivid, powerful visions that stayed with him throughout the day, also and seemed to demand that he share them with others. The dreams felt important, like messages that needed to be delivered, and Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that they meant something significant for his future. Genesis 37:5 through 7 records what happened when Joseph decided to tell his first dream to his brothers. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. In this remarkable dream, Joseph saw himself and his brothers working together during harvest time in the golden fields of grain that surrounded their home. Each brother was gathering stalks of wheat and barley into bundles, working under the warm sun as they had done many times before in real life. The work was familiar and comfortable, just another day of harvest that they had all experienced countless times. But then something amazing and impossible happened in the dream. Something that defied the natural order of things. Joseph's bundle of grain suddenly stood up tall and straight, rising above all the others like a mighty tower reaching toward heaven. As if controlled by an invisible force, all his brothers' bundles began to bow down low before Joseph's bundle, bending like servants bowing before their master or like subjects showing respect to their king. The image was so clear and powerful that Joseph could remember every detail when he woke up. Joseph told this dream with the innocent excitement of a 17-year-old boy who had experienced something wonderful and wanted to share it with the people closest to him. He didn't understand the implications of what he was saying, and he certainly didn't realize the storm of anger and resentment he was about to unleash among his brothers with his words. Before his brothers could fully process and respond to the first dream, Joseph received another vision that was even more shocking and comprehensive than the first one. This second dream was grander in scope and more mysterious in its imagery, involving not just his brothers, but his entire family in a cosmic display of submission and respect. The dream came to Joseph with the same vivid clarity as the first, leaving him with no doubt that it was something important that needed to be shared. Genesis 37:9-10 captures the moment when Joseph revealed this second dream. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I've dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him, and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? In this extraordinary vision, Joseph found himself standing in what seemed like the center of the universe, surrounded by celestial bodies that moved according to his presence. The great sun, source of all light and warmth, bowed down before him, the beautiful moon, queen of the night sky, lowered itself in respect. 11 bright stars, each one shining with its own light, all bowed down before Joseph as if he were their superior. Even Jacob, who loved Joseph more than all his other children and who usually defended his favorite son against any criticism, was deeply troubled by this second dream. The old patriarch understood exactly what the symbols meant. The sun represented Jacob himself, the father and head of the household. The moon represented Joseph's mother, even though Rachel had died. And the 11 stars clearly represented Joseph's 11 brothers. This dream was suggesting that Joseph's entire family, including his own parents, would one day bow down before him in submission and respect. Jacob's rebuke was sharp and immediate, showing that even a loving father had limits to what he would accept from his child. The idea that parents would bow down to their own son went against everything that ancient culture taught about family hierarchy and respect for elders. Yet despite his public rebuke, Genesis 37:11 tells us that his father observed the saying, meaning that Jacob kept thinking about the dream and wondering what it might mean for the future. The combination of their father's obvious favoritism and Joseph's bold dreams about ruling over them created a poisonous atmosphere in Jacob's household that grew more toxic with each passing day. What had started as normal sibling rivalry had evolved into something much darker and more dangerous. A hatred so deep and intense that it would soon demand action. The brothers could no longer hide their feelings or pretend that everything was normal in their family. Genesis 37:4 reveals the depth of their hatred with brutal honesty. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. This wasn't just dislike or annoyance. This was pure, burning hatred that made it impossible for them to have normal conversations with Joseph. They couldn't even manage to be polite to him when their father was watching, let alone show genuine brotherly love when they were alone. Every day, the brothers watched Joseph parade around in his magnificent, colorful coat, while they wore simple, work-stained clothes that marked them as common laborers. They saw their father's face light up with joy whenever Joseph entered the room, a special kind of happiness that was never quite the same when any of them appeared. They listened to Joseph share his dreams about bundles of grain and celestial bodies bowing down to him, while their own hopes and aspirations seemed to matter little to anyone. Genesis 37:8 shows how Joseph's dreams made the situation exponentially worse. And his brethren said to him, "Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us?" And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. The brothers couldn't believe the audacity of their younger brother, suggesting through his dreams that he would one day rule over them like a king ruling over his subjects. The hatred grew stronger each day, feeding on jealousy, resentment, and wounded pride, until it became a living thing that consumed their thoughts and demanded satisfaction. They began to plot and scheme, whispering among themselves when Joseph wasn't around, sharing their anger and feeding each other's desire for revenge. Despite the obvious tension crackling through his household like lightning before a storm, Jacob continued to treat Joseph as his special messenger and trusted representative. The old patriarch seemed blind to the danger he was creating by giving Joseph responsibilities and privileges that naturally should have gone to his older brothers. In Jacob's mind, Joseph was simply the most reliable and trustworthy of his sons, the one he could count on to carry out important tasks with care and precision. Genesis 37:13-14 shows us one typical occasion when Jacob sent Joseph on a mission that would prove to be fateful. And Israel said unto Joseph, "Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them." And he said to him, "Here am I." And he said to him, "Go, I pray thee, See whether it be well with thy brethren and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Jacob regularly sent Joseph to check on his brothers while they grazed the family's sheep and goats in distant pastures, asking him to report back on their work, their welfare, and the condition of the flocks. These were important business matters that affected the prosperity of the entire family. And Jacob trusted Joseph to observe carefully and report accurately on what he found. To Jacob, this seemed like the most natural thing in the world, sending his most trusted son to ensure that his business was running smoothly and that his other sons were fulfilling their responsibilities. But to the brothers, each visit from Joseph felt like an inspection from their father's personal spy. When they saw Joseph approaching in his magnificent coat, they knew he was coming to watch them work, to judge their performance, and to carry tales back to their father about anything he found lacking. They felt like they were being treated as hired servants rather than beloved sons, constantly monitored and evaluated by their younger brother, who had never done a full day's hard labor in his life. These regular missions also served to remind everyone involved of the family hierarchy that Jacob had established. Joseph wasn't just another brother. He was Jacob's representative, carrying his father's authority and speaking with his father's voice. Every time Joseph delivered a message from Jacob or asked questions about their work, the brothers were reminded that they were not trusted, that their father felt the need to send someone to watch over them and ensure they were doing their jobs properly. When Joseph set out from his father's tents to find his brothers near the ancient city of Dothan, he had no idea that his previous visits and reports had planted seeds of murderous intent in their hearts. As he walked across the countryside in his beautiful coat, carrying his father's authority and expecting to be received as the family representative, the brothers who saw him approaching had already moved far beyond simple resentment into the realm of deadly action. Genesis 37:18-20 reveals their chilling plan with stark clarity. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit. And we will say, Some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. The brothers had been talking among themselves for weeks, possibly months, about what to do with Joseph. Their conversations had grown darker and more violent as their resentment festered like an infected wound. They had moved beyond complaining about their father's favoritism to actively planning their brother's destruction. They called Joseph the dreamer, with contempt and mockery, spitting out the words like a curse. Tired of hearing about his visions of ruling over them and disgusted by his apparent arrogance. Now, far from their father's protective presence and watchful eyes, they saw the perfect opportunity to end Joseph's dreams forever. The location was ideal, remote enough that no one would witness what they did, with plenty of deep pits and caves where a body could be hidden. They would kill Joseph quickly, throw his body into one of the deep cisterns that dotted the landscape, and then return home with a carefully prepared story about a wild animal attack. The plan seemed foolproof to them. Wild animals were a real danger in that region. Lions, bears, and other predators that could easily kill a young man traveling alone. Their father would believe the story because it was plausible, and Joseph's body would never be found to contradict their tale. They would be free of their hated brother forever, and they could finally live without the constant reminder of their father's favoritism. Among the 11 brothers gathered in that remote place, plotting their brother's death with cold determination, only Reuben felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the firstborn son. As the eldest, He knew that Jacob would hold him personally accountable for whatever happened to Joseph during this trip. Despite his own feelings of jealousy and resentment toward his younger brother, Reuben couldn't bring himself to participate in cold-blooded murder, especially when he knew his father's heart would be broken by Joseph's death. Genesis 37:21-22 shows us Reuben's desperate attempt to save his younger brother's life. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said unto them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again." Reuben thought he was being clever, using his position as the eldest brother to convince the others to modify their murderous plan. Instead of killing Joseph outright, he suggested they throw him into one of the empty cisterns that collected rainwater during the wet season. His argument was practical. Why shed blood and risk the consequences when they could achieve the same result without actually becoming murderers? Let Joseph die slowly in the pit, and their hands would be technically clean. But Reuben had a secret plan that he shared with no one. After the other brothers had returned to their work or moved the flocks to a different location, he intended to come back quietly and pull Joseph out of the pit. He would take his younger brothers safely back to their father, perhaps earning Jacob's gratitude and improving his own standing in the family. It seemed like a perfect solution. He could save Joseph's life while appearing to go along with his brother's deadly plot. However, Reuben had seriously underestimated the depth of his brother's hatred and their willingness to seize any opportunity that presented itself to permanently solve their problem with Joseph. His plan to secretly rescue his younger brother would fail completely, and the favored son's journey from privilege to slavery was about to begin in a way that none of them could have imagined. While Reuben was away tending to other matters, believing his secret plan would save Joseph's life, his brothers spotted something in the distance that would change everything. A caravan of merchants appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with goods and their destination clear. They were headed toward Egypt, the land of opportunity and trade. Genesis 37:25 describes what the brothers saw. "And they sat down to eat bread. And they lifted up their eyes and looked. And behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt." Judah, one of the brothers, suddenly had an idea that seemed better than leaving Joseph to die slowly in the pit. Genesis 37:26-27 reveals his proposal. "And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. For he is our brother and our flesh." And his brethren were content. Instead of murder, why not make some money? They could sell Joseph as a slave to these traveling merchants, get him out of their lives forever, and avoid the guilt of actually killing their own brother. The brothers quickly pulled Joseph out of the pit where they had thrown him, probably bruised and terrified, but very much alive. Genesis 37:28 tells us exactly what happened next. "Then there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt." 20 pieces of silver. That was the price they put on their brother's life, the same amount you might pay for a young sheep or a tool for farming. Joseph, who had woken up that morning as a beloved son wearing a beautiful coat, now found himself chained with other slaves, walking behind a caravan of camels toward a foreign land where he knew no one and couldn't even speak the language. His colorful coat was gone, his freedom was gone, and his family had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The journey to Egypt would take weeks, and every step took him further away from everything he had ever known and loved. When Reuben returned to the pit, expecting to find Joseph alive so he could rescue him, he discovered it was empty. Genesis 37:29-30 captures his horror and despair. And Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. And he returned unto his brethren, and said, The child is not, and I, whither shall I go? Reuben tore his clothes in anguish, realizing that his plan had failed completely and that Joseph was gone forever. As the eldest brother, he knew their father would hold him responsible for Joseph's disappearance. The brothers now faced a terrible problem. How would they explain Joseph's absence when they returned home? They couldn't tell their father the truth about selling Joseph to slave traders. So they decided to create a convincing lie that would explain everything and free them from blame. Genesis 37:31-32 shows us their cruel deception. And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father, and said, This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. They took Joseph's beautiful coat, the very symbol of their father's favoritism that had caused so much jealousy and hatred, and they deliberately destroyed it. After killing a young goat, they dipped the coat in blood until it was stained and torn, making it look like the aftermath of a vicious animal attack. Then they carried this bloody evidence home to their father, pretending they had simply found it in the wilderness. The brothers didn't even have the courage to tell the lie directly. Instead, they presented the bloody coat to Jacob and asked him to identify it, letting him draw his own horrible conclusions. Genesis 37:33 records Jacob's heartbroken response. And he knew it, and said, It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. The old man's heart shattered as he recognized the coat he had lovingly made for his favorite son, now torn and bloody beyond repair. Genesis 37:34-35 shows us the depth of Jacob's grief. And Jacob rent his clothes, and put sackcloth upon his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Jacob's mourning was so deep and profound that he refused all comfort, declaring that he would grieve for Joseph until the day he died. The very sons who had caused this tragedy now pretended to comfort their father, adding hypocrisy to their cruelty. Meanwhile, far away in Egypt, Joseph's life as a slave was beginning under circumstances that would prove to be remarkably different from what anyone might have expected. Genesis 37:36 tells us who bought him. And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Potiphar wasn't just any Egyptian citizen. He was a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's government, captain of the royal guard, a man of great wealth and influence, who owned a large household with many servants and extensive business interests. At first, Joseph was just another foreign slave in a house full of workers, unable to speak Egyptian properly and unfamiliar with the customs and culture of this ancient civilization. But something extraordinary began to happen that caught everyone's attention, including Potiphar himself. Genesis 39:2-3 reveals the secret of Joseph's success. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Whatever task Joseph was given, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he tended Potiphar's gardens, the plants grew more abundantly than ever before. When he managed the household servants, everything ran more smoothly and efficiently. When he handled business transactions, profits increased beyond all previous experience. Potiphar, though he worshipped Egyptian gods, could clearly see that something supernatural was happening with this young Hebrew slave. Genesis 39:4 shows how quickly Joseph rose in Potiphar's estimation. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. Within a relatively short time, Joseph went from being a common slave to becoming the manager of Potiphar's entire household, trusted with authority over all the other servants and responsibility for all of his master's affairs. The blessing that followed Joseph was so obvious that even Potiphar's Egyptian neighbors began to notice. Genesis 39:5 describes the incredible prosperity that came to Potiphar's house because of Joseph's presence. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. Everything Potiphar owned prospered beyond all previous experience. And everyone knew it was connected to the young Hebrew who managed his affairs with such wisdom and integrity. As Joseph grew into full manhood in Potiphar's house, his character and appearance began to attract attention from an unexpected and dangerous source. Genesis 39:6-7 introduces us to a situation that would test Joseph's integrity in the most challenging way possible. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Joseph had grown into a handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife had been watching him, admiring his appearance, and developing feelings that would lead to serious trouble. Potiphar's wife was accustomed to getting whatever she wanted. As the wife of a powerful Egyptian official, she lived in luxury and was used to having servants obey her every command without question. When she decided she wanted Joseph, she didn't bother with subtle hints or gradual seduction. She simply commanded him directly to sleep with her, expecting immediate compliance just like she received from every other servant in the household. But Joseph's response shocked her completely. Genesis 39:8-9 records his firm refusal and the reasons behind it. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, "Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Joseph's refusal was based on two important principles that guided his life. First, he felt a deep loyalty to Potiphar, who had trusted him with everything he owned and treated him with kindness and respect. Betraying that trust by sleeping with his master's wife would be an act of terrible ingratitude and dishonor. Second, and even more importantly, Joseph recognized that adultery would be a sin against God, regardless of what any human being might command or desire. Genesis 39:10 tells us that Potiphar's wife didn't give up after the first refusal. And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her, to lie by her, or to be with her. Day after day, she continued to proposition Joseph, using every persuasive technique she could think of: promises, threats, flattery, and manipulation. But Joseph remained firm in his refusal, avoiding her company whenever possible and maintaining his integrity despite the constant pressure and temptation. Potiphar's wife's repeated failures to seduce Joseph eventually turned her desire into rage and her passion into a thirst for revenge. she began to plan a way to destroy the young Hebrew who had dared to reject her advances and refuse her commands. Her opportunity came on a day when the household was unusually quiet, and most of the other servants were away on various errands. Genesis 39:11-12 describes the moment when she made her final, desperate attempt. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. And there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled, and got him out. When Joseph entered the house to take care of his regular duties, Potiphar's wife was waiting for him. She grabbed his outer garment and made her demand one final time. But Joseph's response was immediate and decisive. He escaped from her grasp so quickly that he left his garment in her hands and ran out of the house. Now Potiphar's wife had exactly what she needed to destroy Joseph. With his garment in her possession as evidence, she could create a story that would explain everything in a way that made her the victim and Joseph the villain. Genesis 39:13-15 shows us how she constructed her lie. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled, and got him out. Her story was carefully crafted to arouse maximum anger and indignation among the Egyptian servants. She portrayed Joseph as an ungrateful foreigner who had attacked their mistress, and herself as an innocent victim who had fought off his advances with her screams. The garment served as perfect evidence to support her lie, and none of the servants had any reason to doubt their mistress's word against that of a Hebrew slave. When Potiphar returned home, his wife repeated the same story with even more dramatic details. Genesis 39:17-18 records her accusation. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant, which thou hast brought unto us, came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled out. She blamed Potiphar himself for bringing this dangerous Hebrew into their house, making her husband feel responsible for what had supposedly happened. Genesis 39:19-20 shows us Potiphar's response. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him, and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Potiphar's anger burned hot when he heard his wife's accusation, and he immediately had Joseph arrested and thrown into the royal prison where the king's most dangerous criminals were kept. Joseph found himself in one of the worst places a person could be in ancient Egypt. The royal prison where political prisoners, failed officials, and other dangerous criminals were held under harsh conditions. This wasn't a modern prison with rights and protections for inmates. It was a dark, brutal place where many prisoners died and few ever saw freedom again. Joseph had lost everything once more: his position in Potiphar's house, his reputation, his freedom, and apparently his future. But even in this terrible place, something remarkable began to happen that echoed what had occurred in Potiphar's household. Genesis 39:21 tells us the secret. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The same God who had blessed Joseph as a slave was still with him as a prisoner, working behind the scenes to provide help and hope in the darkest of circumstances. The prison keeper, like Potiphar before him, began to notice that there was something different about this young Hebrew prisoner. Genesis 39:22-23 describes how quickly Joseph gained the keeper's trust. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Joseph became the prison administrator, trusted by the keeper to manage all the other prisoners and oversee the daily operations of the facility. The keeper gave Joseph such complete authority that he didn't even bother to supervise him or check on his work. He knew that everything would be handled properly and efficiently. Once again, Joseph had risen from the lowest possible position to a place of authority and respect, demonstrating that God's blessing followed him regardless of his circumstances. Under Joseph's management, the prison ran more smoothly than it ever had before. Conflicts between prisoners decreased, daily routines operated efficiently, and even the harsh conditions seemed more bearable for everyone involved. The other prisoners began to look to Joseph for leadership and guidance, recognizing his wisdom and fairness in dealing with their problems and concerns. After Joseph had been in prison for some time, 2 new prisoners arrived who would play a crucial role in his future, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. Genesis 41:3 introduces these important characters. And it came to pass after these things, that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against his 2 officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were high-ranking officials in Pharaoh's court who had somehow displeased the king and been thrown into prison while their cases were being decided. The chief cupbearer was responsible for all the drinks served to Pharaoh, a position of great trust since he had to ensure that the king's wine and other beverages weren't poisoned. The chief baker managed all the bread and pastries for the royal household, another position requiring absolute reliability and skill. The prison keeper put Joseph in charge of caring for these important prisoners, recognizing his ability to handle responsibility and treat people with respect. Joseph served them personally, making sure they had everything they needed and treating them with the dignity appropriate to their former positions, even though they were now prisoners like himself. One morning, Joseph noticed that both men looked troubled and distressed. Genesis 46:7 tells us what he observed. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? Joseph's compassionate nature showed itself even in prison. He cared enough about these men to notice their emotional state and ask what was troubling them. Genesis 48 reveals what was bothering them. And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Both men had experienced vivid, troubling dreams the same night. And they were frustrated because there were no Egyptian wise men or dream interpreters available in the prison to tell them what their dreams meant. Joseph responded with humble confidence, acknowledging that the ability to interpret dreams comes from God, but offering to help if they were willing to share their dreams with him. Genesis 49:11 records the cupbearer's dream. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded and her blossoms shot forth. And the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph's interpretation was immediate and positive. Genesis 40:12-13 gives us his explanation. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. The baker, encouraged by the positive interpretation given to the cupbearer, eagerly shared his own dream. Genesis 40:16-17 records what he had seen. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream. And behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh. And the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. But Joseph's interpretation of the baker's dream was very different. Genesis 40:18-19 reveals the somber truth. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Genesis 40:20-22 confirms that Joseph's interpretations were completely accurate. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Before the cupbearer left prison to return to his prestigious position in Pharaoh's court, Joseph made a desperate request that he hoped would lead to his own freedom. Genesis 40:14-15 records Joseph's plea. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Joseph briefly explained his situation. He had been kidnapped from his homeland and thrown into prison despite being innocent of any crime. He wasn't asking for special treatment or immediate release, just that the cupbearer remember him and mention his case to Pharaoh when the opportunity arose. It seemed like a reasonable request from someone who had just provided accurate dream interpretation that probably saved the cupbearer's life. The cupbearer agreed to Joseph's request and left the prison a free man, restored to his important position serving Pharaoh directly. Joseph watched him go with hope in his heart, believing that his time in prison might soon be coming to an end. Surely a man who had been helped so dramatically would remember the kindness shown to him and keep his promise to speak to Pharaoh about the innocent Hebrew prisoner. But Genesis 40:23 reveals the crushing disappointment that followed. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The cupbearer returned to his comfortable life in the royal palace, serving Pharaoh's wine and enjoying his restored position, while Joseph remained in prison, forgotten and apparently abandoned by the one person who could have helped him gain his freedom. For 2 full years, Joseph waited in that dark prison, wondering if God had forgotten him and if he would spend the rest of his life as a prisoner for a crime he didn't commit. The cupbearer, who owed him so much, had completely forgotten his promise, leaving Joseph to wait for God's perfect timing to bring about his deliverance. 2 full years had passed since the cupbearer had left prison and forgotten his promise to Joseph. life in the palace continued its normal rhythm of ceremonies, feasts, and the business of ruling the greatest kingdom in the ancient world. But one night, something happened that would shake the very foundations of Egypt and change the course of history forever. The mighty Pharaoh, ruler of millions and master of the Nile, experienced dreams so vivid and disturbing that they haunted him long after he awakened. Genesis 41. 1 tells us when this momentous night occurred. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed. This wasn't just any ordinary dream that fades with the morning light. This was a vision so powerful and realistic that Pharaoh felt like he was actually living through the events he saw. In his first dream, he found himself standing by the great Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt that brought fertility and prosperity to the entire land. Genesis 41. 2-4 describes what Pharaoh witnessed in his first vision. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. 7 beautiful cows, fat and healthy with glossy coats, emerged from the Nile and began grazing peacefully in the lush meadow along the riverbank. They were perfect specimens, exactly the kind of cattle that symbolized Egypt's prosperity and abundance. But then 7 other cows appeared from the same river. These were horrible to look at, skinny and sickly with bones showing through their dull, patchy hides. These sick cows did something impossible and terrifying. They devoured the 7 healthy cows completely, leaving no trace that the beautiful cattle had ever existed. What made the dream even more disturbing was what happened after this impossible feast. Despite eating 7 fat cows, the lean cows remained just as skinny and sickly as before, showing no sign of the nourishment they had just consumed. It defied all natural law and reason, leaving Pharaoh deeply troubled when he woke up. But the night wasn't over. Genesis 41, 5-7 records Pharaoh's second dream. And he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. In this second vision, Pharaoh saw a single stalk of grain, producing 7 perfect ears of corn, full and golden and ready for harvest. They represented everything good about Egyptian agriculture, abundance, prosperity, and the blessing of the Nile's fertile soil. But then 7 more ears of grain appeared on the same stalk, withered and blasted by the harsh east wind that brought drought and destruction. These thin, worthless ears somehow swallowed up the 7 good ears completely, just as the lean cows had devoured the fat ones. When Pharaoh woke up the second time, Genesis 41:8 tells us his state of mind. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. The most powerful man in the world was deeply shaken by these dreams. Something about them felt prophetic and important, like a message he needed to understand. But their meaning remained completely hidden from him. Pharaoh immediately summoned all the wisest men in his kingdom to interpret these troubling dreams. Egypt was famous throughout the ancient world for its learning, magic, and wisdom. The royal court employed dozens of magicians, sorcerers, dream interpreters, and scholars who claimed to understand the mysteries of the future and the messages of the gods. These men had spent their entire lives studying ancient texts, learning magical formulas, and developing their supposed ability to reveal hidden knowledge. Genesis 41:8 continues to describe their complete failure. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. One by one, these learned men listened to Pharaoh's detailed description of both dreams. They consulted their scrolls, performed their rituals, discussed the symbolism among themselves, and offered various explanations. Some suggested the dreams meant nothing important. Others proposed interpretations that contradicted each other or made no practical sense. The magicians tried to use their traditional methods of divination, casting lots and studying the patterns of birds in flight. The sorcerers attempted to contact their gods through incantations and ceremonies. The scholars searched through ancient texts, looking for similar dreams and their recorded meanings. But nothing they did provided Pharaoh with the clear, convincing interpretation he desperately needed. As the hours passed and more wise men failed to explain the dreams, Pharaoh became increasingly frustrated and anxious. These weren't just idle curiosities. They felt like urgent warnings about something terrible that might happen to his kingdom. The images of healthy cows being devoured by sick ones and good grain being consumed by withered stalks seemed to point toward some kind of disaster or catastrophe that would affect all of Egypt. The failure of Egypt's wise men was complete and humiliating. Despite all their learning, training, and supposed supernatural abilities, they couldn't provide their king with the answers he needed. The dreams remained as mysterious and troubling as ever, leaving Pharaoh without guidance and his kingdom potentially vulnerable to whatever threat the dreams might be warning about. Word of the wise men's failure spread throughout the palace, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. If the greatest minds in Egypt couldn't interpret Pharaoh's dreams, where could the king turn for answers? The court officials began to worry not just about the meaning of the dreams, but about how their inability to help Pharaoh might affect their own positions and the stability of the government. As the news of the wise men's failure spread through the palace, the chief cupbearer was performing his regular duties, serving wine to Pharaoh and observing the king's obvious distress about the uninterpreted dreams. Suddenly, something clicked in his memory. A flood of recollections from his time in prison 2 years earlier came rushing back to him with startling clarity. Genesis 41:9-13 records the cupbearer's sudden realization in his report to Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do. Remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. The cupbearer felt ashamed as he remembered how he had completely forgotten his promise to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. For 2 years, he had enjoyed his restored position and comfortable life, while the young Hebrew who had helped him remained forgotten in prison. Now, faced with Pharaoh's desperate need for dream interpretation, he realized that Joseph might be exactly what the king was looking for. He told Pharaoh the whole story, how he and the baker had both received troubling dreams on the same night during their imprisonment, how a young Hebrew slave had interpreted both dreams with remarkable accuracy, and how everything had happened exactly as Joseph had predicted. The cupbearer had been restored to his position, while the baker had been executed, just as Joseph had foretold. Pharaoh listened intently to this account, his interest growing with every detail. Here was someone who had demonstrated the ability to interpret dreams accurately, something that all his wise men had just failed to do. The fact that Joseph was a foreigner and a prisoner didn't matter. Pharaoh needed answers, and this Hebrew apparently had a gift that none of his Egyptian advisors possessed. The cupbearer's memory of Joseph's character also impressed Pharaoh. He described Joseph as honest, humble, and wise beyond his years, someone who gave credit to his God for the ability to interpret dreams rather than claiming personal supernatural powers. This was very different from the Egyptian magicians who boasted about their own abilities and demanded high honors for their services. Without hesitation, Pharaoh ordered his guards to bring Joseph from prison immediately. After 2 years of waiting and wondering if he had been completely forgotten, Joseph was about to receive the opportunity that would change his life forever. The royal guards rushed to the prison with Pharaoh's urgent command to bring the Hebrew prisoner named Joseph to the palace immediately. For Joseph, who had been faithfully carrying out his daily responsibilities as prison administrator, this sudden summons came as a complete shock. He had no idea why Pharaoh would want to see him, but he knew that when the king of Egypt called, you responded quickly and respectfully. Genesis 41:14 describes the hasty preparations that followed. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. Joseph had been living as a prisoner for several years, and his appearance reflected his circumstances. His beard had grown long according to Hebrew custom, his hair was unkempt, and his clothes were the simple, rough garments appropriate for a prisoner. But appearing before Pharaoh required proper preparation according to Egyptian customs and protocols. Joseph quickly shaved off his beard, following Egyptian fashion where most men were clean-shaven except for certain ceremonial occasions. He washed thoroughly and changed into clean, respectable clothing provided by the palace servants. These preparations were essential because appearing before Pharaoh in an inappropriate manner could be seen as disrespectful and might even result in punishment or death. As Joseph walked through the magnificent corridors of Pharaoh's palace, he must have been amazed by the wealth and splendor surrounding him. The walls were covered with beautiful paintings depicting Egyptian gods and victories. The floors were made of polished stone, and golden decorations gleamed everywhere he looked. This was a far cry from the simple tents of his father Jacob, or even the comfortable house where he had served Potiphar. When Joseph finally stood before Pharaoh in the royal throne room, he found himself face to face with the most powerful ruler in the ancient world. Pharaoh sat on a magnificent throne, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, surrounded by courtiers, officials, and guards. The atmosphere was formal and intimidating, designed to remind everyone of the king's absolute authority and divine status in Egyptian religion. Despite the overwhelming grandeur of his surroundings and the life-changing importance of this moment, Joseph maintained his composure and dignity. He had learned through years of adversity to trust in God's providence and to conduct himself with integrity regardless of his circumstances. Whether serving as a slave in Potiphar's house, managing fellow prisoners, or now standing before Pharaoh himself, Joseph remained the same faithful, humble person he had always been. Genesis 41:15-16 records the crucial exchange that followed. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Pharaoh explained his situation directly. He had experienced important dreams that none of his wise men could interpret, and he had heard that Joseph possessed the ability to understand and explain dreams. Joseph's response was characteristically humble and God-honoring. He didn't claim to have supernatural powers or special wisdom of his own. Instead, he gave all credit to God, assuring Pharaoh that the interpretation would come from the Almighty, not from any human ability. After Joseph's humble response, acknowledging that the power to interpret dreams belonged to God alone, Pharaoh proceeded to tell him both dreams in complete detail. He described the 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 lean cows, and the 7 good ears of grain being consumed by 7 withered ears. As Pharaoh spoke, Joseph listened carefully, and the meaning of both dreams became crystal clear to him through divine revelation. Genesis 41:25-27 records Joseph's interpretation. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. Joseph explained that both dreams carried exactly the same message from God. They weren't 2 separate visions, but one unified revelation given twice to emphasize its importance and certainty. The 7 fat cows and 7 good ears of grain both represented 7 years of incredible abundance and prosperity that would come to Egypt. The harvests would be so plentiful that food would be abundant throughout the land, trade would flourish, and everyone would enjoy unprecedented prosperity. But this period of abundance would be followed by something much more difficult. The 7 lean cows and 7 withered ears of grain represented 7 years of severe famine that would come after the years of plenty. This wouldn't be an ordinary dry season or a temporary shortage. It would be a devastating famine, unlike anything Egypt had experienced in living memory. Genesis 41:28-32 continues Joseph's explanation. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine shall consume the land, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Joseph emphasized that this prophecy came directly from God and would definitely happen exactly as revealed. The famine would be so severe that it would completely erase the memory of the abundant years that preceded it. People would find it hard to believe that Egypt had ever experienced such prosperity when they were struggling to find enough food to survive. The fact that God had given Pharaoh the same message through 2 different dreams proved that this was a settled matter that would begin to unfold very soon. The interpretation was both a warning and an opportunity. God was giving Pharaoh advanced knowledge of what was coming so that Egypt could prepare properly and survive the coming crisis. Instead of being caught off guard by the famine, Egypt could use the 7 abundant years to store up enough food to carry the nation through the 7 difficult years that would follow. Joseph didn't stop with simply interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. He went beyond explanation to offer practical wisdom about how Egypt should respond to this divine revelation. He understood that knowing about the coming famine was only useful if the kingdom took appropriate action to prepare for it. God had given Pharaoh this advance warning for a purpose, and Joseph felt compelled to suggest how that purpose could be fulfilled. Genesis 41:33-36 records Joseph's comprehensive plan. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. Joseph's proposal was both bold and brilliant. He suggested that Pharaoh should immediately appoint a wise administrator to oversee a national food storage program during the 7 years of abundance. This administrator would work with appointed officers throughout Egypt to collect 1/5 of all the grain and other food produced during the plentiful years. This 20% tax might seem burdensome during years of abundance, but it would be the difference between survival and starvation during the famine years. The collected food would be stored in specially constructed granaries in cities throughout Egypt, creating a national reserve that could feed the entire population when the famine struck. Joseph's plan showed remarkable understanding of both economics and logistics. He knew that during years of plenty, farmers would be willing to sell a portion of their harvest because prices would be low due to the abundance. The stored grain would maintain its quality if properly preserved, and the distributed storage system would ensure that food could be made available to people throughout the kingdom when they needed it most. The plan also demonstrated Joseph's understanding of human nature and government administration. He recommended that all the stored food remain under Pharaoh's direct control, preventing local officials from selling it prematurely or using it for personal gain. The centralized authority would ensure that the food would be available when the crisis came, rather than being consumed or wasted during the good years. Joseph's proposal wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining Egypt's strength and prosperity, even during the worst of times. If Egypt could successfully weather the 7-year famine while surrounding nations struggled with starvation, the kingdom would emerge from the crisis stronger and more influential than ever before. When Joseph finished presenting his interpretation and strategic plan, the throne room fell silent as Pharaoh and his officials absorbed the implications of what they had just heard. This wasn't the confusing, contradictory advice they had received from the Egyptian wise men. This was clear, practical wisdom that addressed both the meaning of the dreams and the appropriate response to their message. Genesis 41:37-38 tells us how Pharaoh and his court responded. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Pharaoh was deeply impressed by both Joseph's interpretation and his practical wisdom. The plan made perfect sense and offered Egypt a way to turn a potential disaster into an opportunity for even greater prosperity and power. But what impressed Pharaoh most wasn't just Joseph's intelligence or administrative skills. It was the obvious divine wisdom that he possessed. Pharaoh, despite being raised to worship Egyptian gods, could clearly see that Joseph had access to a source of wisdom that went far beyond human understanding. The interpretation had come with such clarity and confidence, and the strategic plan was so comprehensive and practical that it seemed to come from divine inspiration. Pharaoh's question to his servants was really a recognition that they had found someone extraordinary. Where could they find another person who possessed the Spirit of God like this young Hebrew? Pharaoh had been surrounded by advisors and wise men his entire life, but none of them had ever demonstrated the kind of supernatural insight that Joseph had just displayed. The Egyptian officials, who had just witnessed their own wise men fail completely to interpret the dreams, had to agree with their king's assessment. They had seen Joseph not only explain the dreams accurately, but also provide a detailed plan for dealing with their implications. This level of wisdom and foresight was clearly beyond normal human capability. Genesis 41:39 records Pharaoh's conclusion. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Pharaoh acknowledged that since God had revealed these things to Joseph, no one else in the kingdom possessed the same level of wisdom and understanding. The very God who had given the dreams had also provided the interpretation and the solution through this remarkable young man. This recognition wasn't just about Joseph's abilities. It was about the power and wisdom of the God he served. Pharaoh was essentially acknowledging that Joseph's God was superior to all the Egyptian deities who had failed to provide answers through their priests and magicians. The God of the Hebrews had demonstrated his power by revealing the future and providing practical wisdom for dealing with it. Having recognized that Joseph possessed divine wisdom unlike anyone else in his kingdom, Pharaoh made a decision that would shock everyone in the throne room and change the course of Egyptian history. He didn't just thank Joseph for the interpretation and send him back to prison with a reward. Instead, he decided to place this 30-year-old Hebrew in charge of implementing the very plan he had proposed. Genesis 41. 41 records Pharaoh's momentous announcement. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. In one incredible moment, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt, with authority over the entire kingdom and all its people. This wasn't just a temporary appointment to handle the food storage program. Pharaoh was making Joseph his prime minister, giving him authority over every aspect of Egyptian government and society. All the people of Egypt, from the highest nobles to the common farmers, would have to obey Joseph's commands. Only Pharaoh himself would have greater authority in the entire kingdom. The physical symbols of this appointment were as impressive as the authority itself. Genesis 41:42-43 describes the ceremony. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh's signet ring was the ultimate symbol of royal authority in ancient Egypt. With this ring, Joseph could seal official documents and issue commands in Pharaoh's name. Anyone who saw that ring would know that Joseph spoke with the full authority of the king himself. The fine linen clothing and gold chain marked him as a member of the highest nobility, while the second royal chariot announced his exalted position to everyone who saw him traveling through the cities of Egypt. The command for people to bow before Joseph wasn't just about showing respect. It was declaring that he possessed royal authority that demanded the same submission that people showed to Pharaoh himself. When Joseph rode through the streets in his royal chariot, with heralds calling for people to bow before him, everyone could see that a new era had begun in Egypt. Genesis 41:44-45 reveals additional honors that Pharaoh bestowed upon Joseph. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Pharaoh declared that nothing significant could happen in Egypt without Joseph's permission and involvement, making him the effective ruler of daily affairs throughout the kingdom. The new Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, which meant revealer of secrets or savior of the world, marked Joseph's complete integration into Egyptian society at the highest level. His marriage to Asenath, daughter of a prominent priest, further established his position among the Egyptian nobility and gave him important family connections that would help him govern effectively. Genesis 41:46 notes an important detail about this remarkable transformation. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph had endured 13 years of slavery and imprisonment since being sold by his brothers at age 17. Now, at the age of 30, he finally stood at the pinnacle of earthly power, ready to use his position to save not only Egypt, but eventually his own family and the surrounding nations from the devastating famine that was approaching. With his appointment as second in command over all Egypt, Joseph began a new chapter of his life that required him to navigate between two worlds: his Hebrew heritage and his Egyptian responsibilities. His marriage to Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, wasn't just a personal relationship, but a political alliance that connected him to one of Egypt's most influential religious families. The city of On, also known as Heliopolis, was the center of sun worship in Egypt, and marrying into such a prominent priestly family demonstrated Pharaoh's complete acceptance of Joseph as a true Egyptian leader. Genesis 41:50-52 tells us about the children born to Joseph and Asenath during the years of plenty. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. The names Joseph chose for his sons reveal the deep thoughts of his heart during this time of prosperity and power. Manasseh, meaning causing to forget, showed that God had helped Joseph move beyond the pain and trauma of his early years, the betrayal by his brothers, the false accusation by Potiphar's wife, and the years of imprisonment. He wasn't bitter or consumed by thoughts of revenge. Instead, he had found peace and purpose in his new life. Ephraim, meaning fruitful, reflected Joseph's gratitude for how God had blessed him even in a foreign land. Despite being far from his father's house and living among people who worshipped different gods, Joseph had prospered beyond anything he could have imagined. He had risen to the highest position possible for anyone except Pharaoh himself, gained a loving wife and family, and earned the respect of an entire nation. Yet even as Joseph embraced his Egyptian identity and responsibilities, he never forgot his true God or abandoned his Hebrew faith. Unlike many people who might have completely assimilated into Egyptian culture and religion, Joseph maintained his belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He understood that all his success and prosperity came from the Lord, not from Egyptian gods or his own abilities. Joseph's position required him to participate in Egyptian court ceremonies and government functions, but he did so without compromising his core beliefs. He managed to serve Pharaoh faithfully while remaining faithful to his God, a delicate balance that required wisdom, integrity, and constant dependence on divine guidance. His success in maintaining this balance showed the maturity and spiritual strength he had developed through years of adversity. As Egypt's prime minister, Joseph threw himself into the massive task of preparing the kingdom for the coming famine with remarkable energy and organizational skill. The 7 years of abundance had begun just as God had revealed in Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph knew he had a limited time to collect and store enough food to carry Egypt through the devastating years that would follow. Genesis 41:47-49 describes the incredible abundance and Joseph's systematic response. And in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. The harvests during these 7 years were unlike anything Egypt had ever experienced. Fields produced grain in such quantities that farmers could gather it by the handful rather than individual stalks. Fruit trees bore more than their branches could support. Vegetable gardens yielded multiple crops per season, and livestock multiplied rapidly with abundant pasture and feed. Joseph organized a sophisticated collection and storage system throughout Egypt. He established regional centers in major cities where the surplus grain could be gathered, processed, and stored in specially constructed granaries. Each city became responsible for collecting and storing the excess produce from the surrounding countryside, creating a distributed network that could efficiently serve the entire kingdom when the famine arrived. The logistics of this operation were staggering. Joseph had to coordinate thousands of workers, hundreds of storage facilities, and countless tons of grain and other foodstuffs. He needed systems for collecting the grain from farmers, transporting it to storage centers, processing it for long-term preservation, and maintaining accurate records of what was stored where. The fact that he accomplished all this without modern technology or communication systems demonstrates his exceptional administrative abilities. Genesis tells us that Joseph eventually stopped trying to measure the grain because there was simply too much to count accurately. The storage facilities were filled beyond capacity, and additional granaries had to be constructed to hold the continuing surplus. Egypt was becoming the richest nation in the world, with food reserves that would make it the envy of every surrounding kingdom when the famine struck. Throughout these busy years, Joseph never forgot that this abundance was temporary and that the real test was yet to come. While other people might have been tempted to relax and enjoy the prosperity, Joseph remained focused on the future, constantly working to ensure that Egypt would be ready for the catastrophe that God had revealed was approaching. Just as Joseph had predicted, the 7 years of abundance came to an end and were followed by the beginning of severe famine throughout the known world. Genesis 41:53-57 describes the onset of this crisis. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried unto Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph. What he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. The famine wasn't limited to Egypt. It affected the entire Middle East, including the land of Canaan, where Joseph's family still lived. Crops failed completely, livestock died from lack of food and water, and people began to face starvation. Nations that had never experienced such severe shortage found themselves desperate for food, and word spread quickly that Egypt had grain available for purchase. Meanwhile, far away in Canaan, Jacob and his family were struggling with the same devastating famine that affected everyone else in the region. Genesis 42:1-2 shows us Jacob's response to the crisis. Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, Why do ye look one upon another? And he said, Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither, and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. Jacob had heard the reports that Egypt had food available for sale, and he realized that his family's survival depended on making the dangerous journey to purchase grain. The old patriarch was now well over 100 years old, still grieving the loss of Joseph after more than 20 years, and facing the possibility that his entire family might starve to death if they couldn't find food. The decision to send his sons to Egypt wasn't easy for Jacob. The The journey was long and dangerous, requiring weeks of travel through hostile territory. They would need to carry silver and other valuables to pay for the grain, making them targets for robbers along the way. Once they reached Egypt, they would be foreigners dealing with a powerful government that might take advantage of their desperation. Genesis 42:3-4 tells us about Jacob's careful planning. And Joseph's 10 brethren went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, "Lest peradventure mischief befall him." Jacob decided to send 10 of his sons, but kept Benjamin at home. Benjamin was Rachel's other son, Joseph's full brother. And after losing Joseph, Jacob couldn't bear the thought of risking Benjamin's life as well. This decision revealed that Jacob's favoritism hadn't ended with Joseph's apparent death. Benjamin had become the new object of his father's special protection and concern, just as Joseph had been before him. The other 10 brothers understood this favoritism, and it probably reminded them painfully of the circumstances that had led to their terrible treatment of Joseph years earlier. When Joseph's 10 brothers arrived in Egypt and presented themselves before the governor to request permission to buy grain, they had no idea they were standing before the very brother they had sold into slavery 22 years earlier. Genesis 42:6-8 describes this emotionally charged moment. And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, Whence come ye? And they said, From the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew not him. The irony of this moment was overwhelming. Here were the same brothers who had mocked Joseph's dreams about them bowing down to him. And now they were literally bowing with their faces to the ground before him, just as his teenage dreams had foretold. They were seeking food from the very brother they had tried to destroy, completely unaware that their survival depended on the mercy of the person they had betrayed. Joseph recognized his brothers immediately, despite the passage of more than 2 decades. Perhaps their basic facial features hadn't changed that much. Or maybe it was the way they stood together and interacted with each other that triggered his memory. But they didn't recognize him at all. The 17-year-old boy they had sold to slave traders had become a 39-year-old Egyptian governor, clean-shaven according to Egyptian custom, dressed in fine linen and gold, speaking Egyptian, and surrounded by the trappings of power and authority. The transformation was so complete that it never occurred to the brothers that this powerful Egyptian official could be their long-lost brother. In their minds, Joseph was probably dead by now, either killed by the harsh realities of slavery or lost forever in the depths of Egyptian society. They certainly never imagined that the frightened boy they had thrown into a pit could have risen to become the second most powerful man in Egypt. Joseph's initial response was to speak roughly to them and treat them as potential threats rather than welcomed customers. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. Joseph was buying time to process his emotions and decide how to handle this incredible situation. 22 years of separation, pain, and wondering about his family's welfare were suddenly colliding with the reality of seeing his brothers again. Genesis 42:9 tells us what was going through Joseph's mind. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and said unto them, Ye are spies. To see the nakedness of the land ye are come. Joseph remembered his teenage dreams about his family bowing down to him, and here they were, fulfilling those prophecies exactly. But he also needed to understand what kind of men his brothers had become, and whether they felt any remorse for what they had done to him. Joseph decided not to reveal his identity immediately, but instead to test his brother's character and see if they had changed during the years since they had betrayed him. He accused them of being spies who had come to Egypt to gather intelligence about the kingdom's defenses and vulnerabilities, rather than genuine customers seeking to buy grain. Genesis 42. 10-14 records their desperate response to this accusation. And they said unto him, Nay, my lord, but to buy food are thy servants come. We are all one man's sons, we are true men, thy servants are no spies. And he said unto them, Nay, but to see the nakedness of the land ye are come. And they said, Thy servants are 12 brethren, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not. And Joseph said unto them, That is it that I spake unto you, saying, Ye are spies. The brothers tried to defend themselves by explaining their family situation. They were all sons of the same father, honest men who had come only to buy food for their starving family. They mentioned that they were originally 12 brothers, but one was dead, and the youngest had remained at home with their father. When they said, One is not, referring to Joseph, they probably assumed he had died years ago in slavery. Joseph listened to this explanation with intense interest. His brothers still thought he was dead, and they mentioned Benjamin as the youngest brother who had stayed home with Jacob. This confirmed that Benjamin was still alive, and that their father was also still living. After 22 years of wondering about his family's welfare, Joseph was finally getting answers to questions that had haunted him since his enslavement. But Joseph also noticed something significant in how his brothers spoke about their family. They seemed to care about each other and their father in a way that suggested they might have learned something from their past mistakes. The question was whether this apparent concern was genuine or just a convenient story to tell an Egyptian official. Genesis 42, 15-17 shows us the test Joseph devised. Hereby ye shall be proved. By the life of Pharaoh ye shall not go forth hence, except your youngest brother come hither. Send one of you, and let him fetch your brother, and ye shall be kept in prison, that your words may be proved, whether there be any truth in you. Or else by the life of Pharaoh surely ye are spies. And he put them all together into ward 3 days. Joseph demanded that they prove their story by bringing Benjamin to Egypt. If they were really honest men with a younger brother at home, they could prove it by producing him. Joseph's plan was to keep most of them as prisoners, while one brother returned to Canaan to bring Benjamin back. This would test whether they really cared about their family, and whether they would risk their own safety to reunite with their brother. The 3 days in prison gave the brothers time to think about their situation and discuss it among themselves. It also gave Joseph time to observe them and listen to their conversations. What he heard during those 3 days would reveal whether his brothers had truly changed or whether they were still the same cruel, selfish men who had sold their brother into slavery years earlier. After 3 days, Joseph modified his plan slightly, but maintained the pressure on his brothers to bring Benjamin to Egypt. Genesis 42, 18-20 records his revised proposal. And Joseph said unto them the 3rd day, This do, and live. For I fear God. If ye be true men, let one of your brethren be bound in the house of your prison. And go ye, carry corn for the famine of your houses. But bring your youngest brother unto me. So shall your words be verified, and ye shall not die. And they did so. Instead of keeping 9 brothers in prison, while one returned home, Joseph decided to keep only one brother as a hostage, while the other 9 returned to Canaan with grain for their starving families. This showed a measure of mercy and practicality, Their families needed food immediately, and 9 men could carry more grain than 1. But the demand to bring Benjamin remained firm. What happened next gave Joseph incredible insight into his brothers' hearts and minds. Genesis 42, 21-22 reveals their private conversation. And they said one to another, "We are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." And Reuben answered them, saying, "Spake I not unto you, saying, Do not sin against the child, and ye would not hear? Therefore, behold, also his blood is required." The brothers began talking among themselves in Hebrew, assuming that the Egyptian governor couldn't understand their language. They expressed deep guilt about what they had done to Joseph years earlier, remembering how he had begged them for mercy when they threw him into the pit and sold him to the slave traders. They believed their current trouble was divine punishment for their past cruelty to their brother. Reuben reminded them that he had tried to prevent them from harming Joseph, and now they were all paying the price for ignoring his warnings. The brothers clearly felt genuine remorse for their actions, and they connected their current crisis with their past sin. This wasn't just convenient regret. It was deep, lasting guilt that had troubled them for more than 20 years. Genesis 42, the 24 tells us Joseph's emotional response. And he turned himself about from them and wept, and returned to them again and communed with them, and took Simeon from among them and bound him before their eyes. Joseph had to leave the room to compose himself, because hearing his brothers express genuine sorrow for what they had done to him was overwhelmingly emotional. He had wondered for years whether they felt any regret, and now he knew they had been carrying this guilt for decades. Joseph chose Simeon to remain as the hostage, probably because Simeon had been one of the most aggressive brothers in the original plot against him. Genesis 42, 25-26 describes how Joseph prepared them for their return journey. Then Joseph commanded to fill their sacks with corn, and to restore every man's money into his sack, and to give them provision for the way. And thus did he unto them. And they laded their asses with the corn, and departed thence. Joseph not only gave them the grain they needed, but secretly returned their payment money, putting it back in their grain sacks. This act of generosity would create additional confusion and concern when they discovered it. But it also demonstrated Joseph's desire to bless his family, even while testing them. When the brothers returned to Canaan and reported everything that had happened to Jacob, the old patriarch was devastated by the demand to send Benjamin to Egypt. Genesis 42, 36-38 shows his anguished response. And Jacob their father said unto them, Me have ye bereaved of my children. Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and ye will take Benjamin away. All these things are against me. And Reuben spake unto his father, saying, Slay my 2 sons, if I bring him not to thee. Deliver him into my hand, and I will bring him to thee again. And he said, My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If mischief befall him by the way in the which ye go, then shall ye bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Jacob felt like everything was conspiring against him. He had already lost Joseph. Now Simeon was imprisoned in Egypt, and the Egyptian governor was demanding Benjamin as well. The old man couldn't bear the thought of losing Rachel's other son, especially when he had already endured 22 years of grief over Joseph's supposed death. But the famine continued, and eventually the grain they had brought from Egypt was consumed. Genesis 43, 1-2 describes their desperate situation. And the famine was sore in the land. And it came to pass, when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt, their father said unto them, Go again, buy us a little food. When Jacob finally agreed to send Benjamin to Egypt, the brothers prepared carefully for the journey. Genesis 43:11-12 shows Jacob's instructions. And their father Israel said unto them, If it must be so now, do this. Take of the best fruits in the land in your vessels, and carry down the man a present, a little balm, and a little honey, spices and myrrh, nuts and almonds. And take double money in your hand, and the money that was brought again in the mouth of your sacks, carry it again in your hand. Peradventure, it was an oversight. When the brothers arrived in Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph saw his full brother for the first time in over 20 years. Genesis 43:29-30 captures this emotional moment. And he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother, of whom ye spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep. And he entered into his chamber and wept there. Joseph was so overcome with emotion at seeing Benjamin that he had to leave the room to cry privately. Benjamin was more than just his brother. He was his only full brother, the other son of Rachel. And seeing him brought back floods of memories about their mother and their childhood together. Joseph treated all his brothers to a feast, but he was still not ready to reveal his identity. He had one final test to conduct. Genesis 44:1-2 describes the setup. And he commanded the steward of his house, saying, Fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put every man's money in his sack's mouth. And put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest, and his corn money. And he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. Joseph planted his personal silver cup in Benjamin's grain sack, then sent his steward to pursue the brothers and accuse them of theft. This was the ultimate test. Would the brothers abandon Benjamin to save themselves, just as they had abandoned Joseph years earlier? Or had they really changed and learned to protect each other rather than sacrifice family members for their own benefit? When the brothers were brought back to face Joseph after the cup was discovered in Benjamin's sack, they were completely devastated. Genesis 44:13-16 describes their despair. Then they rent their clothes and laded every man his ass and returned to the city. And Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house, for he was yet there, and they fell before him on the ground. And Joseph said unto them, What deed is this that ye have done? Wot ye not that such a man as I can certainly divine? And Judah said, What shall we say unto my lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God hath found out the iniquity of thy servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also with whom the cup is found. The brothers were prepared to accept slavery for all of them rather than abandon Benjamin. This was completely different from their behavior 22 years earlier, when they had been willing to sell Joseph to save themselves from the consequences of murder. Judah, who had originally suggested selling Joseph, now stepped forward to offer himself as a substitute for Benjamin. Genesis 44:18-34 records Judah's passionate plea to Joseph, offering to take Benjamin's place as a slave so that Benjamin could return to their father. Judah explained that Jacob's life was bound up with Benjamin's life, and that the old man would die of grief if Benjamin didn't return home. This speech revealed that the brothers had learned to put their father's welfare and their family's unity ahead of their own interests. Joseph couldn't control his emotions any longer. Genesis 45:1-3 describes the moment of revelation. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, Cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, And the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? When Joseph revealed his identity, his brothers were shocked beyond words. Genesis 45:3 tells us they were troubled at his presence, unable to speak because they were so amazed and frightened. The brother they thought was dead was not only alive, but had become the most powerful man in Egypt, and they were completely at his mercy. But Joseph's first words weren't about revenge or punishment. They were about forgiveness and God's sovereignty. Genesis 45:4-8 records his gracious response. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years, in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Joseph understood that God had used even their cruel betrayal to accomplish his purposes. Their sin had been real and painful, but God had worked through it to position Joseph where he could save both Egypt and his own family from starvation. This wasn't excuse-making or denial. It was recognition of divine sovereignty working through human choices, both good and evil, to accomplish eternal purposes. Genesis 45:14-15 shows the emotional reunion that followed. And he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And after that, his brethren talked with him. The years of separation, pain, and wondering were finally over. The family that had been torn apart by jealousy and betrayal was beginning to heal through forgiveness and God's amazing providence. Joseph immediately began making plans to bring his entire family to Egypt. Genesis 45:9-11 records his urgent invitation. Haste ye, and go up to my father, and say unto him, Thus saith thy son Joseph, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, tarry not, and thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. And there will I nourish thee. For yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household, and all that thou hast, come to poverty. The land of Goshen was some of the best pasture land in Egypt, perfect for Jacob's flocks and herds. Joseph wanted his family nearby, where he could provide for them and protect them during the remaining years of famine. The reunion would not only save their lives, but would also fulfill God's promise to make Abraham's descendants into a great nation. If Joseph's story has touched your heart and reminded you of God's faithfulness in your own life, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who are passionate about discovering the amazing stories and timeless truths found in God's Word. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Someone you know might need to hear Joseph's story of hope and redemption today. Your share could be exactly what God uses to encourage someone who is facing their own pit experience right now. And if you want to dive deeper into more incredible biblical stories that will strengthen your faith and inspire your walk with God, make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Together, we'll continue exploring the amazing ways God works in the lives of ordinary people to accomplish His extraordinary purposes. Thank you for watching, and remember, No matter what pit you might be facing today, God has a palace in your future. Just like Joseph, your story isn't over yet.